So what I wanted to do is use the two frames that are very common in our field, which is the environmental frame and the national security frame. So the environmental frame said, what we're doing damages the ecosystem, it pollutes the atmosphere with toxic substances, which contributes to climate change. In the national security frame, I said we're dependent on foreign oil. It decreases our national energy security, that is our ability to ensure and control our energy supply. So what I wanted to see is that, does framing matter when it comes to people's preferences about changing their own lives? And how strong is that effect? So that led to actually 4 separate versions of the survey. So it was a lot of data collection. So let me just walk you through the first version, and I'll hope that you infer the rest from it. So version 1, it used the environmental frame, and then I first asked the voluntary question for SUVs and trucks, followed by the soft regulation question for SUVs and trucks. I then asked the voluntary question for green energy, followed by the soft regulation question for green energy. Now, every time I asked a question to individuals, I asked them, what is your reason for saying yes or no? To try to figure out what are the main motivators for people's behavior or for people's preferences. Because we've talked a lot about motivation, but it's actually extremely hard to figure out what motivates people's behaviors. So that led to 4 separate versions. And so and this was a paper survey. I actually went out into the Pittsburgh population in a whole variety of different areas and asked people to fill out the survey. So I had 209 participants with a lot of heterogeneity, some SUV owners and some green energy consumers. So now let me walk you through some of the data. Now this is results just for the SUV case. On the y-axis, you have the percentage of participants who said yes. On the x-axis, you have voluntary action versus the regulation. Now, what you find is that a large majority of the participants in the Pittsburgh population said yes. They pledged that the next car that they would buy would not be an SUV or truck. But an even larger percentage said yes for the soft regulation case. So individuals said, yeah, we would like to pay an extra amount. We would like the fact that government comes in and says, all right, let's tax low mileage vehicles. However, if you look at it, they really do not like hard regulations. In fact, if you were to sort of rank order these or sort of order them in terms of what people prefer the most, people really like soft regulations, then voluntary actions, and then hard regulations. So if you wanted to actually change residential behavior, what you might want to think about doing is, how do you use soft regulations in order to change people's behavior? How do you change defaults to make it easier for people but not curb people's choice set? Because psychological reactance is a very, very strong phenomenon. So this is what it looks like for SUVs. Now let's look at green energy. So for green energy, people equally preferred voluntary actions and soft regulations. So that was having the default be green energy and having an opt-out allowance. But again, people really did not like hard regulations, which was a governmental enforced required energy mix, including green energy. So again, this sort of corroborates the idea that people really do not like the government to curb their choice set. They want to be able to choose among different things, but they want to make the choice, the greener option, a little bit easier for them. So then what I wanted to do is I wanted to figure out what are the characteristics of these individuals that said yes for the voluntary action. And this is just the voluntary data. So this is SUVs and trucks. This is green energy. Again, just focus on the parameters that are in color. So the people that said yes to both green energy and SUVs and trucks were the ones that had pro-environmental attitudes. So the more pro-environmental you are, the more willing you are to accept voluntary actions to curb the amount of energy that you use. If you're male, you're less likely to accept voluntary actions. So females are more likely to accept these voluntary actions for the environment. Males are less likely to accept these voluntary actions for the environment. Now, specifically to SUVs and trucks, if you currently own an SUV, you're less likely to say yes that the next car that you buy will not be an SUV, which makes sense. Now let's look at the regulations. So this is, again, SUVs and trucks and green energy. If I give an individual a soft regulation, they're almost 10 times more likely to say yes to that than if I gave them a hard regulation. So if you want to change behavior, try to go after soft regulations rather than curbing choice sets. Yep.
Why did you not ask the same people hard and soft regulations?
Because we wanted to have something to, we wanted a baseline to sort of compare everyone to, so we always asked everyone the voluntary action. The survey would have been too long if we asked them voluntary, soft, and hard. And so it's kind of a trade-off to have a short survey so that you can get people to complete it. So going back to these results, so again, if you're pro-environmental, you're more likely to say yes to a regulation. However, for SUVs and trucks, if you're Republican or independent, you're less likely to say yes to regulations, which also may make sense because you don't necessarily want the government to interfere in your choice set. Then, now let's look at some of their reasons for their preferences. So what are some of the main motivators for saying yes or no in this whole realm? The number one mentioned reason was economic incentives. So if you can change the economic structure for the greener option, that would be the most effective thing that you could do to change behavior. So changing the economics. Then the second reason most mentioned was personal freedom and need for choice. So people really, in this country, people really value their personal freedom and their need for choice. So not constricting their choice set is pretty valuable while you change the economic structure to change people's behavior. The other reason why people do things are environmental reasons and cost, so basically coupling the economics with the environment. And lastly is that their lifestyles require it. So changing social norms would also be very powerful in trying to get individuals to change their behavior. So what we found was that framing didn't matter. So putting a frame as the environmental frame versus the national security frame did not matter in this context because it was almost never statistically significant. For SUVs and trucks, people prefer soft regulations to voluntary, voluntary to hard. For green energy, people prefer soft and voluntary, both towards in regard to hard. For voluntary actions, if you're female and pro-environmental, you're more likely to say yes. For regulations, if you're given a soft regulation, and if you're pro-environmental, you're more likely to say yes. Some of the reasons that you guys should try to be thinking about is economic incentives and personal freedom. So if you can try to change the economic incentives to try to make the greener option more cheaper, for example, that would really, really change behavior. So are there any ways to decrease psychological reactance in a particular population? One hypothesis is that you can first sort of lowball it. So first introduce the soft regulation, get people used to the soft regulation, and then sort of put in a hard regulation. So it's not just, sort of laying down the hammer and saying, all right, you can and cannot do something. You sort of ease people into it. And what do preferences look like for other behaviors? So I'm hypothesizing for my own health and safety, I probably prefer hard regulations to soft and soft to voluntary because I really care about myself much more than I may care about future generations. So this is some future work that comes out of this particular study. I then also wanted to spend a minute talking about the graph that John talked about yesterday as well. And this is default saves lives. So this is effective consent percentage in terms of the percentage of participants that are organ donors with a variety of different countries across the world. Now these countries in blue have an opt-out allowance. So basically, if everyone's automatically an organ donor and you're allowed to opt out of it. The countries in gold are opt-in, so you can choose to be an organ donor, but you're not necessarily already an organ donor to begin with. And that causes a huge percentage change or decrease in the terms of number of participants, number of people that are organ donors. So for example, in the United States, it's opt-in to a particular system. So when you get your driver's license, you can basically choose to say, all right, I choose to opt into the organ donation plan. Now, just changing this opt-in to an opt-out system would save 3,000 lives per year. Now, that's no joke. That's 3,000 people. So we're not necessarily changing the choice structure, but we're just making it easier for the better option to exist. So this is something that I would sort of like the discussions to sort of move towards is how do you make the default greener option in some of these residential homes? So the take-home conclusions from both of these studies are people have large misperceptions of energy consumption for their everyday behaviors, and people prefer soft regulations to hard regulations to change their behaviors.